Hey, it's producer Jacob again. Just wanted to say that we really appreciate you guys being patient with us. Jacob has had some pretty intense family stuff come up in the last week, even more intense than before. And we do want to get you new content, but family stuff comes first. So we appreciate you guys being patient with us. We appreciate the trust and the hours that you have given to cognitive dissidence. We're not going anywhere, but it might be a couple weeks until we're back to a regular cadence. So today's episode is a really good conversation with Roger Baker that we had in early 2022. I hope you guys enjoy.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investment. Joining us on the podcast today is Roger Baker. He is the executive director at the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RAIN, Risk Assistance Network and Exchange. Roger and I worked together at Stratfor over a decade ago, which is really hard for me to really conceptualize that it was that long ago. Roger was the chief analyst at Stratfor when I was just a young intern. So he trained me in Stratfor's analyst development program. So for me, it felt like coming full circle, getting to talk to Roger. I don't know that I'll ever treat Roger quite like an equal because he always felt like the person who trained me, but talking to him on an equal basis about a topic that we both love and have really given a lot of our lives to. We recorded a first sort of part of this podcast on Stratfor RAIN's podcast. So if you want to go over to Stratfor RAIN and listen to the first part of this podcast, it's over there and you can listen to it. But here, Roger and I talk a little bit about geopolitical theory before diving into some practical things about U.S.-China relations, Taiwan, and the future over the next 25 years. So as always, you can write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you have any questions or concerns about the podcast or what we do at Cognitive Investments. I'm always happy to hear from listeners. Otherwise, take good care of each other. Cheers, and I will see you out there. All right, Roger, picking up where we left off from the Stratfor RAIN podcast, RAIN Stratfor podcast. How should I, the RAIN podcast, I guess is what we should talk about. It's really nice to have you here.
Well, it's great to be here, Jacob.
I thought I would turn the tables right around back at you. And before we get into some questions that I wanted to ask you, just sort of throw back at you, what is geopolitics to you? And specifically, I wanted to add on to that, because you mentioned this in the podcast we did with RAIN Stratfor, that you felt that you were in the Mackinder school of thought. So I wanted to ask specifically why Mackinder, because I think I have a couple of his books. I think my giant head is blocking them right now, and the listeners can't see anything anyway. Only Roger and I can see each other. But I don't know. I feel like Mackinder's stuff, well, I'm not going to step on it. Why don't you tell us what geopolitics is, and then we can get into Mackinder.
So I'd go a couple things. I mean, at its base, I would argue that geopolitics is understanding the impact of the intersection of organized people and place over time. And so it emphasizes the role that place plays in shaping groups of people, in providing opportunity, in creating cost, and that there's a time component in there. Geopolitics is a synthetic field of study in the sense that it draws on politics, geography, history, technology, sociology. It draws on military dynamics. All of these different separate fields pull into this central place that tries to synthesize the way in which these interact with each other, but always within a framework of geography and time. And that's the rough definition, I guess, I would give for geopolitics as a field of study. Why Mackinder? Well, one, that's the first gentleman I was introduced to. I look at Mackinder particularly because he did not consider himself a geopolitician. Mm-hmm. He considered himself a geographer. And the best I can tell from research, he only used the word geopolitics once in his career publicly, and that was in accepting an award for something. Um, but he didn't use the terminology at all. He considered his field geography. And if you go back even before what are considered his geopolitical writings, he talks about geography as this synthetic space, that there needs to be one space in academia, with academia growing um, deeper and deeper and narrower. There needs to be one space that teases those all back together and creates a unified picture. And he's arguing this is the place for geography, or what I would argue for geopolitics. That's its role. And of course, he was arguing that at a time where the field of geography was going to be thrown in the garbage, because the perception was geography had done all it could do. They had already mapped the world. What else is geography going to do? And he was arguing that geography was more than geology and physical space. It helped to understand people, and therefore could also help you understand the future, because you could see the differences in people in different places as they've been, for lack of a better word, evolved in relationship to their geography. And therefore, how are they going to respond differently to similar stimulus? And if you could lean forward like that, you could then conceptually make better policy decisions, or at least more informed policy decisions, being aware of what the likely outcome was before you acted, rather than only acting on raw ideals or raw interest.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Democratic Ideals and Reality, he really brings this to a fine point, where he says, look, coming out of World War I, or the Great War, or the war to end all wars at the time, he says, if you act purely from a legalist, judicial, and ideological perspective in how you reshape Europe at the end of the war, you are likely to set in motion um, the conditions for the next war. But if you first and foremost understand the underlying reality, and then try to achieve your ideological goals within the constraints of that reality, you are more likely to be able to achieve what you want at the end. Now, why Mackinder over other geopoliticians, and I know I'm talking too much now, um, is
It's what you're here to do, Roger. You're here to talk.
right. He is not deterministic in his geopolitics.
Hmm.
And one of the concerns that in looking at some of the Nordic and Germanic geopolitics, is that, well, on the one hand, many of them actually, particularly the German school, built a lot of its later concepts off of some of the ideas that Mackinder put forward from a geographic perspective. But those schools tended to tie themselves to the organic concept of states, that states are living organisms, and therefore states um, grow, they eat, they consume, they die. States are the organism in themselves, and effectively, then states not only have the natural instinct, but the right and responsibility to constantly expand and grow and consume. And Mackinder does not seem to put that concept forward, even though he talks about, if he looks forward, there's a logic to, if you take it all to its ad infinitum, to a series of global empires. He really does emphasize this idea of the role of people within it, as opposed to just the role of the state, and finding that balance.
Yeah, that's interesting. And if I had unlimited time, or if I won the Mega Millions $700 million drawing today, I have to go buy my tickets. A reminder to myself. I would sit down and do a comparative study of like Rousseau versus Locke and Mackinder versus Chilen, and talk about how continental philosophers and continental thought was always more about community versus, I guess, should we call it island thought? I don't know if we want to call it Anglo-American thought in the end, but it's really about the geography of islands, allowing you to think that way, more about the individual, and more thinking in terms of everything from individual rights to what you're talking about, the individual actor. I also, just for the listeners, want to pinpoint one of the reasons I think it's so important to think about all of the things we're talking about. It's not just because Roger and I think geopolitics are super important. I mean, it is, obviously. We're both biased to say that. But I don't know if you saw this, Roger. A couple of years ago, before he was advising Trump in the White House, Steve Bannon was throwing around Mackinder's name like it was nothing, like he'd read all of his stuff and like it informed some of his worldview. So some of what we're talking about here has made its way into the White House and into the top echelons of U.S. foreign policy. So I wouldn't say it's dominating U.S. foreign policy, but I think there is a faction within U.S. foreign policy circles that thinks explicitly this way, and it's one of the reasons I think it's important to talk about it. I wanted to throw at you, though, I mean, the thing that Mackinder is most well known for is this geographical pivot of history argument. In some ways, and I haven't done nearly as much reading of Mackinder as you have, but it's in some ways my least favorite of anything I've read from him. It's sort of the most banal, the shortest, the most off the cuff. It doesn't have any of the depth of some of his other work that I've read, but it does seem to be the thing that is enduringly linked to him. So I wonder if you could just tell our listeners what the geographic pivot of history is, whether you agree with my take or not, whether I'm shortchanging it, and what we should learn from that particular tract, if anything.
So the geographic pivot of history is the first of three variations on a theme that Mackinder evolves and develops. It then turns into from pivot to heartland, and then he re-envisions the heartland in the midst of World War II and modifies its geography. In the initial pivot thesis, Mackinder is trying to highlight the role that geography has played in the past, effectively of different modes of economy and different organizations of state, and then how they interact. And as you noted before, Mackinder is of a maritime heritage. And interestingly, in the pivot or heartland thesis, he's looking at a continental construct. And a couple of the things that he highlights, that this pivot area, the initial one, is not a forward-looking dynamic. It's saying, I think if I look at the relationship between geography and history, I can see a pattern. And that pattern is mobile continental power moving out of a central redoubt into peripheral areas in a conquest, basically trouncing sedentary agriculturalists over and over and over again, right? And then he looks at the geography of where these mobile forces come from. And he says that geography, if you look at the watersheds of that geography, it is inaccessible from the sea. That this is a true continental, this is why he changes later to heartland when he's talking about it from what we would now call a geopolitical perspective rather than a historical geography perspective. That this heartland is inaccessible by maritime powers. In the north, because of the ice, its river networks empty into the ice or into inland seas. In the south, because of the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas. And its only opening are these couple of gaps in the west, right? Which we talk about all the time, the Northern European plain and things like that, that open east-west corridor that you see over and over again through history. And what Mackinder then says is, if I look at changing technology in the late 1800s and early 1900s, in particular, he's looking at the railroad, not really looking at aviation or anything like that. He's looking at the railroad because that's the new technology. Thinking of the Prussians, thinking of these other capabilities, says if this heartland power is able to build strong rail connection rather than horseman connection out to the periphery, it exists in a defensible base that cannot be conquered by maritime power. It therefore has internal lines of communication as it's pushing outward to conquer those peripheral areas. And when it conquers those peripheral areas, and this is where he puts this heartland at the center of what he calls the world island, which is Europe, Asia, and Africa. People usually forget the Africa piece and think of just the Eurasia component, but Europe, Asia, and Africa. He says then that central power can control the population resources, the natural resources, the productive capacity of this world island, and by default, it would then be able to dominate the globe. right? Now, is it? So I don't find it a banal concept if you look at what he's trying to do and the way it is influenced. You talk about Bannon throwing around Mackinder, but Mackinder has heavily influenced U.S. foreign policy especially since World War I, when there was a big resurgence of looking at Mackinder, really actually around World War II, a big resurgence in the U.S. where the British didn't really pick him up, but the Americans embraced him. And this was because the heartland and pivot thesis he had seemed to be repeating itself first with Nazi Germany, which again in the 1940s he shifts the potential area of the heartland to potentially include what the Germans were doing in conquering East, um, and and then with the Soviets, that you have this repetition of pattern. And today the fear is Belt and Road Initiative is the next iteration of this thesis. Can you tie together the world island into a single economic bloc that then could push outward against global maritime? And that also contrasts the concept of, that Mackinder points out in relation to these, of the idea of the organizer versus the ideologue. And he largely attributes ideologues and ideology driven policy as a maritime policy, and autocracy and organization as a continental theory or policy. And Mackinder, despite what some people argue, Mackinder is pro-democracy. He ultimately is. I mean, that's the point of his book: is if we're going to save democracy, here are the things we need to be aware of, because you can't just shove it down people's throats. It's not going to work. So I think that has shaped the way the United States looks. And if you think about U.S. interventionist strategy in Eurasia since World War I, even, it is about ensuring, it's that old British concept of balance of power, ensuring no single power is able to dominate the Eurasian space.
Yeah, although I think apparently we need a remedial lesson on shoving democracy down people's throats. I think apparently we forgot that one. But okay, I'm chastened. I won't throw so much shade at Mackinder anymore. But can I
But
ask?
you're right. He's overused and he's exploited. He's used
Yes.
poorly. I think the over focus on the heartland and the pivot misunderstands Mackinder. Mackinder wrote on economics. Mackinder came up with the term manpower as a measure of economic capacity. Mackinder recognized that because geography was complete, that the map of the world was complete, that all territory was now claimed or occupied, that we were moving out of a world where there was some buffer space and into a world where every action by a power would reverberate globally. He recognized the coming of globalization not only from a sense of economic opportunity, but also risk.
Do you think that his theories are still, because you mentioned specifically, and I thought this was a great point that isn't made enough, that he was thinking in terms of late 1800s technology. So the railroad was the thing that he was thinking about the most. Do you think specifically the heartland theory or any of these other things that you've spoken about, have they been overtaken by new technologies? Are they enduring enough to where he's still relevant? Is it sort of half and half? Where should we land in thinking about applying Mackinder's analysis to a world that has technology that he, for all of his farsightedness, couldn't imagine?
So I am contemplating declaring the end of the Heartland thesis.
Mm.
And
You
I'm
heard it.
declaring
You
the
heard it here first on the cognitive dissonance podcast.
I'm declaring the end of the Heartland thesis not necessarily because of technology. So if you look at the aviation, did aviation fundamentally alter the concept of power? Well, in some ways, but in some ways it didn't. Right. Despite the U.S. or Israelis deciding that they were going to win all wars only by air power, in the end it is always necessary to exert land power. Right? You can't only win by air. You can't only win by sea. Territory is territory. Geography still matters. Place still matters. Position still matters. So I think that air power did alter it. Missiles, space, things like that have altered it. But I think the most fundamental alteration has been the change in the Arctic climate.
Mm.
Russia is no longer hemmed in by ice on the north. Russian rivers now empty into accessible ports. Russia is technically now vulnerable to maritime incursion. And the Russians recognized this long before the Americans or the Canadians or the Nordic states recognized the strategic implication of climate change in the Arctic, where everyone else focused on the ecological impact and the social impact. The Russians focused on the strategic impact. And if you go back, you see them starting to rebuild their Arctic forces by the late 20-aughts and certainly in the 2010s. As they're seeing this climate change and seeing that they have now one of the longest unprotected maritime borders out there. It's also the center, though, of their resources, their natural resources. So from the Russian perspective, that opening of the maritime frontier, and if the predictions are right, by 2035, 2040, it will pretty much be year-round maritime access, at least on the Russian side of the Arctic. That completely changes the concept, the strategic concept of Russia for hundreds of years in the past, right? So I think that is the big change in the Heartland thesis, that Russia is no longer secure in its northern flank and therefore always looking south. Russia has to look north now, not just for a few missiles and missile defense, but for true open transit. So the opportunities and the risks have now emerged.
Well, and I mean, as always seems to be the case with Russia's geography, they're screwed. I mean, they really this doesn't help them at all. The only time you ever hear this take is when people are talking about how the Russians are taking over the Arctic and they have, 50 icebreakers and the US has one. But the problem with the Arctic is the same problem they have with every single other route to the sea that they have. It can be blocked by the United States on one hand, by Europe on the other hand. I guess China could block it on the other hand, too. There's no real good way for them to use the Arctic the other direction. It really is, I guess, another weakness that they have to think about. I don't know how Russia continues to balance all these weaknesses in the long run.
But I would argue that as a route, it is much more open than the real constraints that they've had in places like the Baltic or the Black Sea, or their very narrow Pacific coast. So there's some greater capacity there. But yeah, you've got to go through the Bering or the Barents, and you run into constraints in each of those areas. And then again, like I said, where yes, in World War II you supply the Russians through Archangel, and you sort of tap into the Arctic to do it. But imagine if Russia's northern frontier is now open and vulnerable to the assertion of maritime power. And the Russians, for example, are in discussions with the Kazakhs now about potentially opening an inland port on the Kazakh-Chinese-Mongol border, because the rivers are navigable that far out to Russian ports in the Arctic. And if you go back to the thesis of the role of the Mississippi in allowing the United States to develop and emerge, and the constraint on Russia because its rivers were not conducive, and therefore Russia was pushed into east-west orientation and rail orientation and things of that sort, which it never fulfilled. If you suddenly have north-south river connectivity, it potentially changes the opportunity in Russia. Now, is their population, is their economic, is their technology able to fulfill that? Maybe not. But then does that create a new potential stress for the Russian-Chinese relationship? Because for the longest time, China never wanted to rush into Russia, despite their large population. There was no opportunity. What if opportunity is opening up? Is that going to be the new tension spot between the Chinese and the Russians, like you're starting to see the Chinese start to fill in on the Russian Far East?
Yeah, and boy, they must be. I mean, I'm sure they were kicking themselves already for selling Alaska, but it must really stick in their craw that they sold the key to the Arctic actually being a useful entryway to the rest of the world for them.
There was some Russian Duma guy who recently came out with some assertion that they need to take it back.
Well, they're welcome to try. Any of the Russian listeners, I wouldn't advise it. Roger, before I turn to picking your brain about some other stuff, I wanted to also ask you something that will be slightly nerdy and indulgent, but listeners, I promise it'll pay off in the end. You were the one that taught me net assessment, and I've used it with every client I've ever worked with. And usually, I have to spend the first hour explaining what the heck it is, and sometimes I don't even know what it is. It's kind of just a way of putting stuff together. So you asked me about political risk and its definition on your podcast. I thought I might ask you to tell us what a net assessment is and how. You and I haven't talked about net assessment for years now. So how, if at all, since the last time we talked, your views on net assessments have evolved over the years?
So I still use the model. We our view of a net assessment is slightly different than a traditional net assessment, because a traditional net assessment is a net, right? It's a net between two. It's a comparative assessment. And our net assessment is actually for a baseline assessment of a particular place, all right? It's looking at a place um, from the 7 pillars of geopolitics, if we want to use, add numbers and things like that, right? First and foremost, what does the geography tell us? And geography, not just in the sense of topography, um, but geography in the sense of rainfall, of subsurface minerals, of land cover, of transportation infrastructure, population density. All of these things start to give us an understanding of a space, right? The United States is not the United States. The view from the northwest corner of New Mexico is very different than the view from the center of Boston, right? Um, and if you look at the United States and you start laying over things like population density, transportation infrastructure, primary mode of economy, these things, you're going to start seeing interesting differential patterns of different parts of the nation, right? And so using that same method to look at other countries, then go in and say, let's talk politics, economics, security, right? And politics, which is, and in each of these, look at them from an internal and an external point of view, right? Internally, what is politics? Well, politics is about power and power relationships, right? It's not just about the government, or is this a democracy or an autocracy? It's how is power moved, and power in many places is completely, in the informal sector, is almost as important or more important than the formal government sector. So politics, economic, security. Then we look at society, which I consider its own bucket, separate from those others. And all of these overlap each other, so that's a thing. But society, how does the society and structure of society work? And that's where you can get into interesting historical dynamics that last longer than shifts in the political dynamics, right? There are deeper patterns in places than often what you see just on the surface of politics. Um, and being able to assess those, and where does society lead politics? Where does it trail politics? Um, when you have certain economic issues happen, how do different aspects of society react in different ways, and what tensions or opportunities that create? Um, Look at technology and the way technology is changing and evolving and altering the relative value of geography, accessibility or use or lack thereof, and looking at those components, and then history. And I use history in a couple ways. One is to say, um, nothing happens now just now. It's part of a flow. So I need to use history to understand, where am I in the flow? Look for repetitive patterns. If I see a pattern, it doesn't necessarily mean it must keep repeating, but I need to understand, why would there be that pattern that emerges? What are the underlying forces that create that up and down cyclical pattern? And are those forces likely to still come into play going forward? And I'm also able to use history to test theories. So I look at certain aspects of geography and structure, and I say, my assumption would be, if this exerts a force on the way in which organized population is going to perceive themselves from strength, weakness, cost dynamics, how would I expect them to act and respond? And I can look through history to see, do I see those or not? And if I don't, why don't I? What am I misreading about the space? Things like that. So then I use all of that to try to define the space. And then ideally what we can do is use that to say, if I push stimulus X, what is the most likely response Y? Right? So use them as a way to not model in the sense of numerical modeling, but model in the sense of a richer understanding of the space. Try to model responses to different stimulus or different actions.
For the listeners, you did not see that Roger was so passionate here that his cat decided to make an appearance on the podcast, and we were very, very blessed to have her or him. I have no idea, but Roger, I also know that. Well, I'll throw a question that I think I know the answer to, and it's probably going to tee you up to knock it out of the park. But do you? It sounds like net assessment can only be used in relation to place. So, for instance, could you make a net assessment of an industry? Could you make a net assessment of a particular technology? Or do you think that is a place where the tool itself falls short?
I think you can. So one of the things, in net assessments, I think from the last time we were working together, the nation, the state is usually the unit that we use. They are not consigned to particular borders, to particular political borders, right? You can look at regions, you can look at subregions. I worked with some universities, and we did a net assessment of their campus.
That's fun.
And mapped out these different patterns, and how the intentional transportation corridors weren't always the transportation corridors followed, right? New paths emerge across grass rather than following sidewalks because of different relationships that emerge between different buildings, right? So you can apply it in different ways. I think you can apply it to industries. They all have a geographic component as well, right? In an industry, the geographic component may be about a combination of looking at accessibility to resources, whether in the locality or whether in effective and easy transportation infrastructure. It may look at the dynamics of trained or educated labor, to be able to work or not work within that industry. The fluidity of it. It can look at things, other aspects too, water availability, that have an impact on the way in which these play. So you can do net assessments of and take the process and apply it in slightly different ways to industries, to segments, to non-state entities. We've used it to look at militant organizations, or things like that, because they have a core geography and they have a diffuse geography, and their capability and their actions and things are shaped differently based on where they are within that geographic realm.
It's funny that the thing you said about the college campus made me think of my own time in college, which was when the Israelis and the Palestinians. I mean, they're always fighting with each other, but when I was in college, they were in one of their Israel-Gaza wars, and there was a lot of unrest on the campus between Jewish student groups and between Muslim student groups, and each one would sort of have their week on the quad. So one week you'd have these posters up with this many missiles and all these things that the Palestinians are doing. Then the next week you'd have these are the things the Israelis are doing, and it's terrible. And my suggestion to them was that we should really we should take the quad and we should make the quad sort of the map of Israel, and we should have a corner here that is the Gaza Strip and a corner here that is the West Bank, and we can pelt people with water balloons from the Gaza Strip and then go in and destroy their this was not well received, and I'd probably get kicked out if I even suggested it if I was still in university. But I like the idea of using micro examples to make geographic arguments. We've talked a little bit about the abstract stuff. I'd like to lean in now to applying some of this, and you have the benefit of some hindsight, and so I wanted the first question I wanted to ask in terms of applying some of the concepts that we've talked about is, first, how long have you worked at Stratfor Rain? Is it 25 years the way LinkedIn says, or is it even longer?
It'll be 25 years this December. We'll have completed a full 25 years. Yeah.
Well, first of all, that's remarkable, and congratulations. Like, you should be proud of that, I think. But I wanted to ask, what is the thing that has changed the most in the world since you started at Stratfor reign? And then what do you think is the biggest thing that will change in the next 25 years?
I think what's changed the most is the perception of a unified, victorious, single model for global organization, conceptually the North Atlantic political economic model, right? That liberal economic political trade model. Um, that if you go back to the mid '90s and the late '90s, it was a truism in some ways that model was the inevitable direction of the world. And every country was going to follow it. And that's what shaped so long of US China policy, for example, right? So long as we keep working with them and talking to them, they'll eventually become Democrats too.
Mm-hmm.
The recognition that that is not universal, despite the fact that there may be a proselytizing desire to make it universal, I think is one of the biggest changes in the world. And therefore in our interaction with the business community or other places like that, the recognition that you simply can't operate under one assumption of a future global path. That fragmentation, localized dynamics matter a lot and really shake things up. So I think that would be my answer to the first half. Most important change or most significant change of the next 25 years. I hate to take that and then push it forward 25 years because that goes against everything I believe in. But we're in the opening stages of the return to true multilateralism, right? And if we think about the first 400 years of a multipolar world, it was very violent and competitive and chaotic. The anomaly being that the Cold War was actually a relatively stable period of world history, of modern world history. And then the post-Cold War was perceived as being stable. There was a lot of localized conflict. But even things like 9/11, it elicited a U.S. response, but it wasn't necessarily existential, although at the moment of action, it had to be perceived that way. So we're moving back, I would argue, into a world where things like we're seeing in Russia, Ukraine may not be so anomalous. The assertion of national economic security and therefore banning certain exports or tighter and tighter trade restrictions and things like that, it may not be so anomalous. These are the results of moving back into this true multipolar system, and it starts breaking down that sense of unity, that and when you have more recognition that is breaking down, it then facilitates it, and the more we see it happen, the more likely it is to continue happening.
I feel like one of the truisms about the reason for the relative stability of the Cold War is the advent of nuclear weapons. And we certainly have never had a multipolar geopolitical era where nuclear weapons were around or where there was any technology that was even analogous in a similar way. Do you think that nuclear weapons limit the extent to which competition and violence can happen in this multipolar era? Do you think that actually nuclear weapons get used in ways that are unimaginable now? How do you think about that particular technological phenomenon in this world?
So, well, I would hope that they still exert the same deterrent component that they did in the Cold War. Couple of things that I would consider. One, despite their deterrent capability in keeping direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union down, they did not quell proxy conflict. right? And they actually didn't quell border or near neighbor action by nuclear powers against non-nuclear powers, right? Including the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Um, Anything that happened right at the end of the World War II in Western Europe. None of those were precluded by the existence of nuclear weapons, nor is the 2014 and now action in Ukraine. It shapes the likely response by the other nuclear power. But as you note, that was a bipolar nuclear system. China is in the midst of a massive nuclear breakout. China is moving away from minimal deterrence to a large nuclear capability. Most nuclear doctrine has been based on a bilateral structure.
Hmm.
I don't know that there is the full extent of how to manage the three big nuclear powers plus an expanding number of small nuclear powers. Right? In some ways, the small nuclear powers remain pretty deterred because if they utilize the weapon against a large power, that's the end. They're completely gone. But they use them as a deterrence against conventional force, right? The North Korean lesson from Ukraine, which was the North Korean lesson from Libya and Iraq, was you have to have these weapons. You can never give them up, right? Because if you don't have it, the nuclear power will feel confident invading you, and your nuclear partner will not feel confident countering the other nuclear power. Right?
Yeah. I mean, to your point, in some ways, we could even argue maybe that nuclear weapons increased proxy conflict because what they did was they made it so that the United States and the Soviet Union wouldn't actually duke it out head to head. And I assume the Chinese, I mean, the war that nobody talks about enough is the Korean War, which I can't think of a more significant conflict during the Cold War than the Korean War, and everybody seems to skirt over it. And that was really, it was a straight on China-US war, but China didn't really have nukes at that point. So, and I wonder in some ways if they learned that lesson then, that they were never going to get taken advantage of that way.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese felt that they were duped by the Russians at that point, by the Soviets in part. And they were face to face with the U.S. Now they claimed they weren't. They claimed it was volunteers. I mean, if you want the origin of Little Green Men, there it is. Um, it was this volunteer force. But yeah, they did. The U.S. and the Chinese went head to head. The U.S. put lots of constraints on its own forces. So because the Chinese played coy, the US limited its own ability to strike inside China. So all of those bridges along the northern border, they ran parallel to the river rather than perpendicular to the river when they were bombing them. Well, you have a less likely chance of hitting your target. You're under anti-aircraft fire from the other side of the river, and you're not allowed to fire back. Right? Those limitations. So there were even then the U.S. put some constraints on its willingness to act on the Chinese. It also constrained the Taiwanese, the nationalists in Taiwan, who thought about making a move on southern China at the time. But I think you're right that the nuclear power may actually make these proxy conflicts increase and create a lot of caution in the way other people respond. And that's the lesson China's trying to push on Taiwan, right? That you can't truly trust the United States to come in because they're not going to risk nuclear confrontation with China over a little island right off the Chinese coast.
Roger, you've been so generous with your time, and I appreciate it. And let's do this again. This is not the only time. I hope you'll come back on.
Oh, certainly. Thank you, Jacob.
All right. Cheers. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.